Today's lecture is going to continue from that with the three continents coming together. So contact between the Europe, Africa, and the Americas, the conquest of Native Americans, and colonization of the Americas. And so, yeah, continuing chronologically into that. In the previous class, I talked about the Mexica, who built their city of Tenochtitlan. And so we learned about Tenochtitlan being one of the largest cities in the world. The leader at the time of contact being Moctezuma or Montezuma or Moctezuma. And then we get to new material. So how many people were there in the Americas at the time of contact? And the truth is, we don't know. But there are people that have studied the subject and have come up with different estimates of how many people there were. And they don't all agree. The numbers I'll be going with in this class are these larger numbers, the first ones. And then the number after this dash is just to show you that other experts, think it might be a little bit less or a little bit more. So there were 7 million people in what is now the United States and Canada. Although some scholars think it could be a little less than that, 5.7, or more than that, 10 million. For the greatest concentration of people in the Americas was in Mesoamerica for North America and the west coast of South America for South America. And so they were about 40 million. And so this is primarily the Aztec Empire, the Maya, and Tehuantinsuyo, the ones we know more as the Inca. Although some argue that it was higher than that, maybe around 60 million. And so the number we're going with is 50 million people in the Americas right before contact. So contact happened in 1492 with Columbus. They're saying, an estimate for 1491 is 50 million. Although there are some who believe that it could have been double that, more like 100 million. But it gives us a sense of how many people were living in the Americas and where they were. How does that compare to Europe? I didn't find a source. I haven't found the source that says how many people were in Europe in 1491. I did find one that said 61.6 million for the year 1500, and then 70 million in 1550. And so at that rate of growth, it'd be about 59 million in 1491. And so in other words, they are of comparable size. There were at least about the same number of people in the Americas as there was in Europe. 50 to 100 in one case, and about, like around 59, 60 million in Europe at that time. And now I mentioned before about how historians, don't just try to not just focus on elites anymore. And I may have used the example of, when we think of Europe, in medieval Europe, we think of the kings, the queens, the nobles, the knights in shining armor. But those people made up less than 10% of the European population. The overwhelming majority were peasants and serfs. More than 90% were peasants and serfs. Now, another important context that helps inform contact with 1492 is that there were Arab Muslim people that are referred to as the Moors who took over the Iberian, or took over most of the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula is where today we find the countries of Spain and Portugal. And they were there for about 800 years. So they were there for a very long time. And there were some Spanish kings, like the king of, Aragon and Castile, or the kingdoms, those two kingdoms, who joined forces to reconquer the Iberian Peninsula and get rid of Muslim people. And coincidentally, they completed the Reconquista, the reconquering of the Iberian Peninsula, the expulsion of Muslim people from that land in 1492. So when Columbus comes across the Americas in 1492, there is no separation between the reconquest and sort of the contact and conquest of the Americas. It was very much informed by that Reconquista. How did that inform it? Well, the fact that these wars were justified with religious purposes. It was Christians, more specifically Catholics, getting rid of the Moors and rewarding their soldiers, their conquistadors, their conquerors, with control of land for getting rid of non-Christian people. And so that's one way that in what was happening in the Iberian Peninsula informs what Columbus and the Spanish do in the Americas once they arrive. Countries, we talk about places like Spain and Portugal and Italy and Germany, but a lot of these places didn't exist yet. In 1492, for example, Spain did not exist as such yet. There were these two kingdoms, like I mentioned, who joined forces to get rid of the last strongholds of the Moors, and they eventually become Spain. And so a lot of these places that we think of as countries weren't countries yet, which is why I have them in quotes. Hierarchy, hierarchy being very much entrenched in European culture. And then there's the importance of Portuguese sea travel. The Portuguese on the Iberian Peninsula were the leaders in sea travel at the time, and it was an important time because they needed a new route. They needed to find a new route to get to Asia, to India, and so they begin going into Africa for trade. They start hopping along the coast, trying to make their way to Asia. In the process, they run into some islands off of Europe and Africa, like the Azores, the Madeira, the Canary Islands, and the Cape Verde Islands. Those become important because the things that Europeans did in those islands are very much the same thing they did once they arrived to the Caribbean. So when they arrived to the Caribbean, they didn't have to all of a sudden come up with a new playbook. What do we do? They just do what they had just done already in these islands off of the coast of Europe and Africa. They'd show up, they would claim it for their homeland. If there were Native Americans there, they would try to enslave them. They would try to find out if there's any wealth. They would enslave them to grow things that crops that were in demand back in Europe. When the Native Americans fought back, they killed them. If they ran away, then they started replacing them with African slaves. And so, again, all of these things they had already been doing off the coast of Europe and Africa. So when they stretch out further to the Americas, they continue doing what they had already been doing. It wasn't, they didn't have to come up with a brand new, it wasn't entirely a new scenario. Or it was, but they just continued doing the same thing they were doing. You watched the video, Clash of Cultures already, that talks about Columbus arriving to the Caribbean. When he discovers quote unquote America, he arrives to the Caribbean. That documentary introduces you to the Taino people that he encountered in the Caribbean. I would add to that these two other important tribes that he encountered that are not mentioned in the documentary. That is the Arawak and the Carib, from which we get the name Caribbean. The documentary introduced you to Fray Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spaniard who initially arrived with plans of being a conquistador himself, but then he, becomes a religious, a Catholic friar, and he ends up becoming a big advocate. It's what he's most remembered for, is being an advocate for the Native Americans in the Americas, but specifically in the Caribbean. And so he fought for decades to get the Spanish king and queen to recognize that Native Americans were human, that they had souls, that they could be converted to Christianity. And so he's most remembered for that. He's more complex than that, but that's what he's remembered for. We're also introduced to Enrique. Enrique was a Taino man in the Caribbean whose family and tribe was killed by the Spanish, but he was raised by the Spanish. Then when he's a young man, he's married and his wife gets assaulted by the conquistador in charge of that area, and he rises up in arms. And that's an important part of his story, is that it doesn't fall into the big narrative that we're usually taught of Europeans came and they just conquered and they never lost. So therefore it was inevitable that Europeans could not lose. But in part it's because the Spanish didn't want anyone to find out about those instances where they did lose. And so then we don't learn about those. And so historians are trying to change that a bit. So Enrique fought against the Spanish for 14 years, and he was never defeated. And so ultimately, Fray Bartolomé de las Casas negotiates a peace agreement with the Spanish, and Enrique is allowed to go off into the mountains with his Taino people and live at peace as best they could, or at least that was a promise they were given. Now, the documentary makes it seem like Native Americans disappeared. And, 90% of Native Americans did die from disease. That's without even counting any of the violence directed towards them. But that doesn't mean that they cease to exist. About 10 years ago, I remember reading an article about Puerto Rico in the Caribbean. And it was a DNA study that found that 25% of the people in Puerto Rico still have Taino ancestry. And so if they became extinct in, by the year 1500, you wouldn't have 25% of the Puerto Rican people today with Taino ancestry. And so, again, that's part of the way the Spanish told the story for 300 years, was erasing and making it seem like Native Americans were no more. But, that's part of, there are Native Americans still around today, and not only still around, but millions and millions who still speak their indigenous languages in the Americas, including, of course, for Latin America, not just in North America. All right. So contact, new information, not included in that documentary. Columbus arrives to the Caribbean. So the Caribbean becomes a base of operations from where to launch expeditions of exploration and conquest. And so, they conquer and get established in the Caribbean, starting in 1492. Then in 1519, Cortez leads an army of 450 to Mexico. And again, you can see how close Cuba is to the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. Cortez arrives, and he arrives to this area that was populated by Mayan people. Now, the Mayans were no longer in their classic period at the height of their civilization, but there were still millions of Mayans living there, with their culture intact, their language, their writing. So Cortez arrives with his army, and he finds a lot of Mayan people. He finds a lot of books. He tries to communicate with people there. He tries to communicate, and they tell him, you know what? There's someone you need to meet. That person that he needed to meet was Jerónimo de Aguilar. Jerónimo de Aguilar had been part of an expedition that we never learn about. We only hear about the ones who succeeded. It turns out Jerónimo de Aguilar was part of an expedition that was, and I don't recall exactly how long prior, but at least a couple years prior. It may have been more like 7 years prior. And this previous expedition that tried to conquer Mexico got shipwrecked. And as far as we know, everyone died except 2 people. We only know of 2 survivors of that expedition. One of them is Jerónimo de Aguilar. And so, they sent for him. He had been living with the Mayans for at least a couple years. Here are 3 representations of him. One of them is portraying him as, kind of saying that they found him naked, living among the natives, and, Cortez is clothing him. And then in this one, he's being remembered as a conquistador, a knight in shining armor. And then here he's remembered as kind of like a Catholic saint almost that helped spread Christianity to the Americas. And so the fact that Jerónimo de Aguilar lived among the Mayans meant that he spoke Mayan. So he was able to become Cortez's interpreter. And so then when they arrive to the Yucatan Peninsula, they're better able to communicate, where can we find wealth? In what direction do we go to find who's in charge around here? And they're basically telling them, you got to go to the Aztecs. You got to go to Tenochtitlan. And so they hop along the coast, making their way in that direction. But they did also tell him about the second survivor. The second survivor was Gonzalo Guerrero. And so again, he was part of that shipwreck. Here we go. It was 7 years, in 1511. So he was a survivor of that shipwreck. And during those 7 years, he lived among the Mayans. He integrated into their culture. He married a Mayan woman and started a family. He got tattoos, which wasn't a European thing. And his children are believed to be the first mestizos, the first people that are the result of Europeans and Native Americans in the mainland of the Americas. There had to have been others in the Caribbean prior. And Gonzalo Guerrero did not do as Jerónimo de Aguilar. He decided not to go back with the Spanish. He told them, you know what? I've started a new life here. I'm happy here. You know, I'm also all tattooed up and, you know, I probably wouldn't be accepted in European culture. So I'm just going to stay with them. And so he did. He decided not to go back to Spanish society. In fact, later on in the 1530s, he was found dead among Mayans that were fighting against the Spanish. And again, someone that we don't typically hear about. All right, so the Cortez and his army of 450 are hopping along the coast, making their way. While they're doing that, they come across a Mayan tribe that they get into a fight with, into a battle. This Mayan tribe happens to be a tribe that trades in slaves. And as a peace offering to Cortez and his army, they negotiate peace with Cortez by giving him 20 women. You know, treating them like property. They give them to Cortez and his army. One of those women was this person known by all these different names: Malinali, Malintzin, Marina, and Malinche. Initially, Malinali, Cortez gave her to one of his lieutenants. And, you know, the Spaniards, again, they're justifying their conquest with religion, with Catholicism. And they assault and rape these women. But they see themselves as good Christians. So they baptize them with Christian names and make them Christians. And somehow that makes it better in their minds. That's how and so let me share here. So Malinali was her name, even though they found her with this Mayan slave trading group. She was originally Aztec or Mexica. And so her Nahuatl name, that's the Aztec language or Mexica language, Nahuatl or Nahuatl. Her Aztec name, her Nahuatl name was Malinali. Then it became Malintzin. That suffix, "tsin," there's different stories about it. Some people say that "tsin" was an ending to a word that makes it diminutive. And so then Malinali, if you call Malinali Malintzin, you know, kind of makes it like little Malinali, kind of like how you turn Jim into Jimmy or Bob into Bobby. You add that part at the end, it makes it little. But another interpretation is that "tsin" was actually an honorific suffix, and it only became diminutive after the conquest of by the Spanish, where they would use it towards kind of as a way of kind of putting down, making fun of the Native Americans by calling them little so-and-so. But that at the time, it was actually a term of honor or respect. There's probably truth to both of those. All right, so then the Spanish are given these 20 women. Among them is Malinali. They baptize her with the name of Marina. And Cortez learns that she speaks not only Mayan, because she lived with the Mayans, but that she speaks Nahuatl, the Aztec language. What's a little bit of backstory there is that, so she was born into an Aztec family. Her father died, and when her mother remarried, I don't know if it was the stepfather or both of them or what, but they decided to get rid of her. And that's how eventually she ends up with these Mayan slave traders, and then gets given to Cortez's army as a peace offering. So Marina, or Malinali, she speaks Mayan, she speaks Nahuatl, the Aztec language, and she very quickly picks up Spanish. Initially, they kind of create this telephone, line where one translates from one language to the other, and then Jeronimo takes it from that language to Spanish. But very quickly, she managed to learn good enough Spanish so that she makes Jeronimo de Aguilar obsolete and becomes the primary sole interpreter of Cortez. She was also very young. She was probably like 13, 14. And so she's this young girl, a young woman who, had been made a slave by the Mayans and then by this Mayan tribe. And then now she's taken as property by the Spanish. She's given to a lieutenant, then taken by Cortez when he realizes her speaking abilities. And so she serves Cortez. She ends up having a child by him. She becomes not only an interpreter, but kind of an informant and a spy. When they arrive to new Aztec towns, villages, cities, she tries to embed herself and kind of fit in and find out whatever information she can. And at least on one occasion, she told Cortez that they were planning to attack him. And so then he's able to preempt that, preemptively attack them instead and avoid a surprise attack. And so she becomes very valuable. She eventually makes it with Cortez to the Aztec capital and interprets for Cortez and Moctezuma. And this is also important and representative. This is representative of them speaking. And in Nahuatl, the Aztec language, the term for like chief or leader is Tlatoani. And Tlatoani means like the one who speaks. And so the fact that she was speaking for Cortez was very symbolic of her status and importance. And again, another possibility of why she would be referred to with a scene, with that, with this idea that that was a term of honor in the Aztec language. Ultimately, Malinali is how do I put this? For 500 years, for the most part of 500 years, she's remembered primarily as the Malinche. And Malinche has become synonymous with traitor. For most of Mexican history, she's remembered as the Aztec woman who betrayed the Aztecs and helped Cortez defeat them. Now, the last like almost 50 years, since the 1960s and 70s, increasingly historians have written about her much more favorably than prior to that. Now they recognize all these things about her, like, did she betray the Aztecs? Or in a way, it's like Aztec society betrayed her by giving her away to the Mayans. Is she a traitor? or was she a very young woman just trying to survive and make herself useful to her current, the current people that had power over her and so forth? And then, there's the age difference and all that. And so, yeah, current accounts are much more sympathetic to Malinali's point of view. And the term Malinche is falling out of favor to describe her. And so she is recognized as very important to Mexican history. So they have statues and busts. All right, so these are the 4 factors that I'm going to emphasize because I don't think they get I don't think they get enough credit. So the Spaniards with their army of 450 hop along the coast. They make their way to Veracruz. From Veracruz, then they go inland, trying to make their way to Tenochtitlan. And typically the way that Cortez told the story, and therefore the way that most accounts refer to the story of conquest, is that the Spanish arrived to what became, to Mexico, and that they were brave and they had superior technology, and that's why they were able to conquer the Aztecs. And I don't deny any of that. I do think that Cortez and the conquistadors were very brave doing what they did with a small army trying to take on a population of 200,000. And I do think they had technological superiority with suits of armor and horses and so forth. But I don't think that actually totally explains it. I think that's the way he would write his letters to King Philip II of Spain to get support and favorable, favors from the king. All right, so one of the important factors that doesn't get enough attention, I think, is the interpreters. And so the interpreters primarily Malinali. Another factor is Quetzalcoatl. You were introduced to Quetzalcoatl when I talked about Teotihuacan. And so Quetzalcoatl was that feathered serpent god that the Mexica inherited from Teotihuacan. Quetzalcoatl was believed to be a real person at some time in the past. And part of his legend is that he had been banished, but that he was destined to come back and reclaim his throne. And so when the Spanish arrive, when Cortez arrives with his ships, sea vessels larger than they had ever seen, when the Spanish arrive, they shoot cannons at the, what do you call it, kind of the tree line, to scare off and impress the Native Americans on the coast. They arrive with horses that they had never seen, with suits of armor, with steel, with these kind of like, what are they? Kind of like primitive muskets, or like mini cannons. And so, they at the very least entertained the idea that maybe it was. In the past, I think there were accounts where people would make it seem like, okay, this is definitely true. They thought that Cortez was Quetzalcoatl. Now people question it more. But I do think there's some truth to it because it's the best explanation I know of that explains why the Aztecs allowed Cortez and his army to walk right into Tenochtitlan. They didn't fight them. They allowed them to walk right in, welcome them. And then they took advantage of that, kidnapped him, and so forth. And I'll talk more about that in a second. On their way to Tenochtitlan, they encountered Tlaxcala. Tlaxcala was that place that was right next to Tenochtitlan that the Aztecs had never conquered. And so it was their lifelong enemies, the Tlaxcalans. And so the Tlaxcalans initially offered to help Cortez, and they did give him 6,000 warriors. So Cortez's army of 450 becomes 6,450. But once they're allowed into Tenochtitlan, they didn't need those warriors. So Cortez is allowed to walk in. He's welcomed in. Once he's there, he kidnaps Moctezuma and kind of holds him as a hostage so that the Aztecs would give him all the gold and all the wealth that they could. They ransacked the place for months, trying to just get all the wealth they could. After many months, I think it was 5 months of being in Tenochtitlan, seizing the treasury and plundering the city. Then there was a religious procession that the Aztecs had, and the Spanish were certain, they believed that this religious procession was the beginning of the Aztecs fighting back, organizing to fight back. Whether that was their plan or not, they made it happen because they attacked the religious procession and they started fighting back. And they succeeded. They succeeded in kicking out Cortez and his army. They killed 75% of the Spanish soldiers and kicked them out of Tenochtitlan. A couple things here. I did forget, I didn't talk about this. I mentioned that Tlaxcala was their undefeated neighbor. I didn't mention that they had ritualized flower wars. What that means is that Tlaxcala and Tenochtitlan, or the Tlaxcalans and the Mexica, they would have ritualized war that they called the flower wars. And so this meant that, it's like there's harvest time, there's springtime, and then there's wartime. Like they had a season where they would go to war. They had their own rules where it wasn't really about defeating. That's part of the reason. It could be that the Aztecs never defeated Tlaxcala because it was just convenient for their religious beliefs to have an enemy next door that they could have these ritualized wars with. And so they would go to war with them, but they would meet out, they wouldn't attack Tlaxcala. They would meet out in in a kind of an agreed location. And their goal was to capture each other, not to kill each other. They would capture them, bring them into Tenochtitlan, and then sacrifice them to their gods. And so they served a religious purpose. And Tlaxcala being smaller than Tenochtitlan, I'm sure they weren't happy about being in that situation. All right, so the Spanish preemptively attack this religious procession. The people of Tenochtitlan fight back, and it works. They kill 75% of the soldiers, and they kick out all the Spanish. But so then the Spanish, when they got kicked out, they went to Tlaxcala, and that's where they waited, with the Tlaxcalans protecting them. They waited for more reinforcements to arrive. They waited to heal from their battle wounds, and they prepared to go back and try to conquer Tenochtitlan again. But in that meantime, In that meantime, which was months, smallpox hit the population of Tenochtitlan and killed 50% of the population. And even the ones that weren't killed, there were people who weren't killed who got very sick as well. And so this makes me think of, our experience with the pandemic, where about 1% of the population died. And, it sounds small, but it's like over 1 million people. Now imagine if we had hit with an epidemic that killed 50% of the population. Just complete devastation. Hence, why smallpox or disease is one of the 4 important factors that, in my opinion, don't get enough credit. And then, of course, there's Tlaxcala, one of the 4. When Cortez waited for reinforcements, he did get some reinforcements, but maybe they, after losing 75% of their army, maybe they recouped their original size. But even if they had doubled it, it's still, it'd still be like less than 900, and they're going up against a city of, if 50% died, then it'd be over 100,000 people. So when they go back to try to defeat the Aztecs and their capital city, they go back with 75,000 Tlaxcalan warriors. So at this point, the Tlaxcalans feel like they're the ones using the Spanish to defeat their lifelong enemies, not the other way around. Because his army of 500 or 800, 900, is that plus 75,000. And when they arrive to Tenochtitlan, they lay siege to it for 2.5 months first. So to lay siege means to surround it and not let anything in or out. And so that means, for 2.5 months, they cut off their fresh water supply. They cut off their ability to get food from the mainland, and so further weakened them more before going in and fighting to take it over. And so then when they do, and they succeed in conquering the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. All right. In this class, we don't look at South America very much, but it's a very similar story in South America, where instead of the Aztecs, it's the people we call the Inca. Instead of Cortez, it's Pizarro. Instead of Moctezuma, it's Atahualpa. Very similar. They go in, they're allowed to sort of contact them without a fight. They kidnap the leader. They hold him hostage to get all the wealth they can, and then they kill him. Now, one thing that's counterintuitive about this is that the larger the group, or the more hierarchical the group was, the bigger the reward for the Spanish. And so what I mean is, when they took out the Aztec capital, or defeated Atahualpa, the leader of the Inca, what they did is simply put themselves in that place, and they used the empire that was already there as a system to control all the smaller tribes that were controlled by this empire, by this group. And so they took out the head and put themselves in that position. as opposed to the Mayans. Remember, the Mayans didn't have one leader that controlled all Mayans. And so the Spanish could still go to any Mayan tribe and defeat it, but there was no one Mayan tribe that they could defeat and then control them all. As a result, the Mayans end up with a lot more independence. And it's not until the mid-19th century that there's a big war called the Casta War, in which kind of westernized Mexicans, at this point no longer Spaniards, but Mexicans, or the Mexican state ends up defeating and getting more control over the Mayan territories. So there's this irony that the more hierarchical the group, the more beneficial it was for the Spanish. The documentary you watched introduced you to, so again, the Caribbean was a base of operations. From there, they went to Mexico. From there, they went to South America. And from there, they went to what eventually becomes the United States. The first part of the United States, to which Europeans get to after Columbus, is Florida. And so you watch the documentary where Hernando de Soto leads an army. He is there, or his army is there. This is the path they take. They're there from 1539 to 1543. There's different groups that they encounter. And so they encounter Timucua in Florida, the Confederacy in South Carolina, the Coosa and Mobila in Alabama, and then finally the Natchez tribe along the Mississippi. And so that would be modern day Mississippi or Louisiana. When they encounter the Natchez mortally wounded De Soto, and he died. The Spanish buried him in secret. They wanted the Native Americans to think that the Spanish were like gods, because they would read, they would learn from, so like the Spaniards who took over the Inca read about what happened with the Aztecs. And actually, De Soto was with Pizarro conquering the Inca before he goes on to what is now the southeastern US. And so they learned from each other. And so his soldiers buried De Soto in secret. Till this day, we don't know where he was buried, because they wanted the Native Americans to think that they were immortal, that they may be gods. But, yeah, he died, and the Natchez ran them out, and what was left of his army hopped along the coast and made their way to Mexico to reunite with kind of Spanish society. Colonization. What is the oldest continuously occupied community in what is now the United States? Well, Native Americans were here first, so it would make sense that it would be a Native American community. And we learned about the Anasazi. Well, it turns out that it was essentially the Anasazi people. In these two places in New Mexico, Acoma Pueblo and Taos Pueblo, people have been living there for almost 1,000 years, since around the year 1075. Now let's talk about Europeans. What's the first city founded by Europeans in America? Well, Europeans first arrived to the Caribbean, not to the United States. And like I mentioned before, in this class, America is not just the United States. And so Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic in 1496 is the first permanent city founded by Europeans in America. Now, next, what's the oldest continuously inhabited settlement founded by Europeans in what is now the United States? Then we get some more familiar ones. But before we get to the ones we learned about in US history, again, Europeans first arrived to Florida, and so it makes sense that that's where the oldest continuously inhabited settlement founded by Europeans would be. In 1565, they established St. Augustine in Florida, and it's been inhabited ever since. In most of these examples, there were other places that were established prior, but at some point in history, they were abandoned. And so hence why they kind of lose this continuously inhabited title. And at the same time that Jamestown was being founded on the East Coast, the Spanish were in the rest of what became the United States. So at the same time, they were founding places like Santa Fe, New Mexico. And so again, not going with this narrative of just the expansion of the US from east to west, but looking at how things are happening throughout parts of what become the United States, not just following the expansion of the United States. So yeah, St. Augustine, Santa Fe, and Jamestown around the same time. And then we get to Plymouth Rock, 1620, which is the one we identify with the most. Yeah. All right. Colonial life, again, religion was an important justification for the conquest. And so it becomes a very important factor for the Spanish as part of their conquests. An example of that would be the Virgin of Guadalupe, where the Aztecs contact was made in 1519, and Tenochtitlan fell to the Spanish in 1521, 2 years later. 10 years after that is when this account of the Virgin of Guadalupe is said to have happened. That was in 1531, so 10 years after 1521. And the story of that is that there was an Aztec man who was baptized with a Christian name of Juan Diego. And one day he was going over this hill, and the name of the hill is Tepeyac, close to modern day Mexico City. And when he was doing that, the Virgin of Guadalupe appeared to him and asked him to go tell the Archbishop that she wanted a temple built for her on Tepeyac Hill in her honor. And so, based on so that is said to have happened. Juan Diego had a lot going on in his life. He had like a sick relative. He was busy with that. He didn't get to it. So the next time he needs to go over this hill, he tries to take a different route, kind of avoiding the Virgin of Guadalupe, but she appears to him anyways, and basically says, Juan Diego, what's going on? Why haven't you done what I asked? And the traditional story kind of has them in this very paternalistic relationship, using this very stereotypical language of how Native Americans were supposed to act in front of Spaniards. And so, the way he's portrayed is like, oh, you're, kind of like Your Highness, I'm just a poor little Indian. They're not going to listen to me. They're not going to build, something just because I asked. And so then she basically tells them, okay, I'll give you proof. I'll give you a miracle so that you can help convince them to do what I'm asking you to do. So she tells him, grab that tunic, that cape-like thing you're wearing, go to this side of the hill, pick some roses, and those roses are going to be proof of the miracle. And why would that be a miracle? because back then, this is before kind of refrigerated shipping, where we can get, today we can get roses or flowers even though it's frozen outside. Back then, if you didn't have it in the season when it grows right there, you're not going to see it. And so yeah, that was a miracle. He goes to the archbishop. He demands to see him. Once he sees him, he opens up his tunic. And to his surprise, not only did he have roses, but the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe had been imprinted on his tunic. And so that was a miracle. He agreed to build a temple for her. And it's a story that has been very successful throughout Latin America in the conversion of people. She's so popular that in Mexico, she might be more popular than Jesus Christ himself. People that aren't very religious will identify with the Virgin of Guadalupe, not only those that are more religious. And so, yeah, it's a very successful story. Yes. I think he's supposed to be just like an angel. Yeah. Eva? Oh, cool. All right. So that's the official story. Now I'm going to tell you a different story. And by the way, so this is a cathedral of the Virgin of Guadalupe in Tepeyac Hill today. And, one of the most visited places. But it turns out there's another way of looking at this. It's based on this idea of religious syncretism. Religious syncretism was a practice used by the Spanish that used the existing beliefs of the Native Americans to help them convert to the new approved religion and symbols. And so this meant that wherever they would go around and destroy any temples, any shrines, any symbols of their previous deities, and replace them with, if there was a statue to a deity, they would destroy the statue and put up a cross. If there was a temple, they would destroy the temple or use that the stones of that temple as a foundation or as the literal stones and bricks to build a new chapel, for example. There are places where there were pyramids that had religious meaning. They tore down the top of the pyramid and then used the base of the pyramid as a foundation for a church or a cathedral. And so this made it so that the Native Americans could continue praying, could continue doing pilgrimages to the same places they were already used to doing that, only now it was to the new approved religion. What does this have to do with the Virgin of Guadalupe? Well, it turns out that hill of Tepeyac was already a place that had religious meaning for Native people there. And it was associated with this female deity named Tonantzin. Now, in Catholic theology, the theory behind, because there are many apparitions of different virgins throughout the world, and the way they work that out theologically is they say that these are all different versions of the Virgin Mary, Mother of Jesus. And so that's kind of theologically how they work out all these different apparitions of virgins throughout the world. So the Virgin of Guadalupe, first of all, the most popular virgin in Spain at that time was already a virgin called the Virgin of Guadalupe, based out of Spain. And so in that sense, they just created a new Virgin of Guadalupe that appeared in Mexico. Then this one was brown-skinned and spoke Nahuatl, spoke the Aztec language. to Juan Diego. And she was also, similarly to how the Virgin Mary is the mother of Jesus, Tonantzin was also the mother of deities, or a mother of gods. And so again, it was about superimposing an approved symbol in a time and place where they had already prayed to a very parallel symbol prior to that. And it was very effective. Like I said, she's very popular throughout the world, really. In fact, Juan Diego was canonized as a saint in the early 2000s. And so yeah, it's, and for those of you that are, I don't know, have an affinity to the Virgin of Guadalupe, I apologize for introducing you to this different version of it. I grew up with a lot of love for the Virgin of Guadalupe myself. And so it kind of breaks my heart to learn this other version of history. I'd also mention that in historical records, the church records do not mention anything about the apparition of the Virgin of Guadalupe and the building of a temple in her honor. That doesn't happen until 100 or 200 years later that they start talking about that. And so that's another important factor in, whether it really happened or not. Yeah, there's so much more. Maybe I can mention just a little bit more. On the other side, on the side of the Catholic Church, claiming that trying to prove that it's real. Every couple decades or something, they come up with something new to validate the veracity of the Virgin of Guadalupe. So they'll say things like, the tunic in which her image was imprinted, that material is something that should have disintegrated in these 500 years. And so it's a miracle that it still exists. They'll say that they've had people analyze it with microscopes and that they can't tell how the image got imprinted in the material. And one of the most recent ones, maybe about 15 years ago, they said that someone analyzed, again with a microscope, her eyes. And they said that in her eyes, you can see the constellation of the stars the way they would have been over the sky over Mexico in 1531. And so every so often there's all these things to validate, that this is, something that really happened. All right. Throughout the 300 years that Mexico and much of Latin America was a colony of Spain, or was colonized by Spain, they developed this racial caste system, the Castas. These are 16 paintings of 16 different castes. And essentially they were, so there was this whole racial hierarchy that was implemented for 300 years. Until this day, people still live with the legacies of it, the same way that we live with the legacies of US conceptions of race as well. So a peninsular was the highest in the racial hierarchy, and this was a person born in Europe, peninsular from Spaniard or Portuguese person being born in the Iberian Peninsula. After that were criollos. Criollos were people of full-blooded European descent, but that were born in the Americas. But they were second-class citizens. They could have lived in Mexico City for 4 generations, and there was kind of a glass ceiling. There was a limit to how high they could ascend in society, because someone from Europe could just, be assigned and show up and become, the viceroy of New Spain and so forth. and the local people were always second class. There were Indios or Indians or Native Americans. There were Black people. And then there's the result of various combinations of these people. So I mentioned mestizo for a combination of European and indigenous. There was mulatto for a combination of white and black. And sambo was a term for indigenous and black. And as you can see from the 16, it gets a whole lot more complicated than that. And that's, you might notice each painting has 3 people in it. It's a father, a mother, and a child. And so with each one of them, they're saying if you get a criollo who has a child with an India, then the result is a mestizo, and so forth. And you notice that they're all also dressed differently, and that's because your rights in society were determined by what caste you fell into. And each caste fell somewhere in that racial hierarchy.